Good morning, everybody. It is great to see you here for our second day of the Vermont Organics Recycling Summit, organized by the Composting Association of Vermont in partnership with the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. This year's summit is being held as a kickoff event for International Compost Awareness Week, which starts this Sunday. We've also adopted the International Compost Awareness Week's theme, which is Compost Nature's Climate Champion. And I just want to give a shout out to students from Deb Nair's Compost Ecology and Management class at the University of Vermont. Every year they do these International Compost Awareness Week posters, and I'm going to be featuring them in my intro slides throughout the week, but they're also all online. You can check them out at compostingvermont.org/VORS. I'm Natasha Duarte, the director of the Composting Association of Vermont, and we're really excited to be continuing our program after yesterday's in-person program. I'd like to start by thanking all of our fabulous sponsors without whom we could not hold this conference this year. Those include Community Bank, Eco Products, Prohibition Pig was a venue sponsor for yesterday, Addison County Solid Waste Management District, AgriLab Technologies, Casella, Food Cycler, Nature Cycle, Vermont Natural Ag Products, Viably, CV Compost, the Vermont Produce Program at the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, and Woods End Laboratories. So a couple new sponsors this year, which is fabulous to be growing the VORS family, and we really appreciate their support. Here's today's program of events. We're here at the 9 o'clock hour. We're going to be talking about composting in New Hampshire, collaborations with Vermont, and leading new programs. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen while I introduce our speaker and invite Majestic to go ahead and share your screen. Majestic Terhune is an associate planner at the Upper Valley Lake Sunapee Regional Planning Commission based in Lebanon, New Hampshire. She has overseen a variety of programs, including those that advance food waste initiatives. Majestic has worked with municipal staff, school district staff, and local residents to envision and get excited about composting in New Hampshire. So with that, Majestic, please take it away.
Thank you, Natasha. Good morning, everyone. My name is Majestic Terhune, and like Natasha said, I'm an associate planner with the Upper Valley Lake Sunapee Regional Planning Commission, or UVLSRPC. Today, I will be introducing you to the state of composting in the state of New Hampshire. I'll be speaking a bit about New Hampshire regulations surrounding composting, and then get into the work that the Regional Planning Commission has done to support the state's efforts. To give you a little background about UVSRPC, the Upper Valley Lake Sunapee Regional Planning Commission is one of 9 regional planning commissions in New Hampshire. We serve 27 municipalities, with most of those being small, rural towns. UVSRPC assists with a variety of municipal planning efforts, including solid waste, housing, and transportation. We have been fortunate to have funding to focus on solid waste operations and assistance over the past several years. Acting as a regional entity has additionally allowed us to take broad action across the area, connecting organizations, towns, and individuals. We often work with partners who also work regionally, including some located just across the Connecticut River in Vermont. With this regional basis, we're in an incredible position to connect resources and ideas. Before I get too into it, I just want to note that the presentation today and work discussed throughout the presentation is supported by a USDA solid waste grant. USDA solid waste grants have supported UVLSRPC's work on waste management for over a decade, including in our composting programs. So, what is the state of food waste in New Hampshire? Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, we're producing a lot of it. In 2020, the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, or NHDES, estimated that about 165,000 tons of food waste were disposed of by residents, businesses, and institutions. That's approximately 24% of municipal waste generated that year. Well, We know we shouldn't be so wasteful. The state doesn't want us to be so wasteful. It comes at both an environmental and a financial cost. So, an HTS laid out the state's goal of a 25% reduction in waste by 2030 and a 50% waste reduction by 2050 in its most recent waste reduction plan, which was published in 2022. It's an ambitious goal, which is great, but may also seem at odds with waste trends nationally, which suggests that the amount of waste generated per person has increased. Likewise, our solid waste facilities in New Hampshire still have a ways to go. Most solid waste facilities in New Hampshire are not actively pursuing initiatives such as composting programs, and most facilities are municipally owned. Like in our region, many of these municipalities throughout the state are small towns that have a limited number of staff and capacity overall. Given these waste reduction goals, the New Hampshire General Court established a hierarchy of waste management that is similar to the EPA food recovery hierarchy, which if you attended yesterday's sessions, you might be familiar with. Outlined in the waste reduction plan, there are a few steps taken by the state to assist with reduction. In March 2022, we saw the enactment of new changes in the solid waste permitting process. Notably, permit by notification facilities are no longer required to go through an extra process for composting all food scraps, including meat and dairy. A new drop-off permitting exemption is also now active, which enables sites to collect 1 cubic yard, or about 45-gallon buckets of food waste without a permit. So, in reality, that kind of translates to co-ops or community centers being able to serve as collection points without a solid waste facility permit. This will hopefully make it easier for startup food scrap haulers to develop a network of pickups in rural areas, which are often harder to serve, which are often harder for haulers to serve. Additionally, a community composting facility permit exemption enables facilities to process up to 5 cubic yards of food waste per month without needing a solid waste facility permit. So if you have a solid waste facility, or if you have a transfer station that wants to maybe start a program, but without going through maybe more of a permitting process that would be required based on what you already have permitted, you can start doing that at a smaller level. Notably, in June 2023, New Hampshire State Legislature also passed House Bill 300. This House bill banned any entity generating over 1 ton of food waste or more per week from disposing of such waste in a landfill or incinerator if an alternative facility for food waste exists within 20 miles and can adequately handle the waste. As part of the House bill, $1 million is going towards New Hampshire Solid Waste Fund, and $500,000 of that will be allotted for grants for businesses or municipalities to purchase equipment and develop food waste infrastructure. In all, changes to the solid waste permitting process and the upcoming food waste ban represent the major changes in New Hampshire food waste regulations over the past several years. Okay, so we have these statewide hopes, dreams, and goals for food waste reduction. We have the 2025 ban just around the corner, and many municipalities are either not aware of the ban or haven't had the capacity to significantly plan for it. There are also all these new ways to really start a composting program, but again, municipalities may not be aware and they may not feel like they have the resources to pursue these initiatives. So, when most transfer stations have limited staff and capacity to advise operations, learn about composting, and help residents learn about food sorting and food waste, what do we do? Well, at UVLSRPC, as part of our job, we help them. Over the past several years, UVLSRPC has received USDA solid waste grants that have enabled us to help several of our communities. In this presentation, I'll be going through our work with municipalities, schools, and residents. So to start with our municipalities, we help our municipalities in a few ways, including with a multi-day compost training geared toward municipal staff and transfer station operators. This training typically comes with a small fee, which includes all the trainings throughout the 2 days, physical materials, breakfast, and lunch. The trainings are open to people and groups around the region and are supported by composting partners in Vermont and Maine. These trainings typically begin with learning the importance of composting, including where it falls in the food hierarchy, composting regulations, the science of composting, and various ways to then pursue composting at your facility. In addition, part of what makes the workshops fun and memorable is that they're also hands-on. The later workshops demonstrate how to make a compost pile, calculate space needs, manage compost, and complete compost site design. Working with partners in Vermont and Maine brings new perspectives and a lot of experience that we really benefit from and appreciate at the RPC. In addition, we reach out to town leadership across select boards, departments of public works, and transfer station staff to raise awareness about the possibility of composting and our ability to help with a pilot program. Doing this helps us track the readiness of our various municipalities to implement composting programs, which in turn helps us become more effective at communicating resources to our towns and scoping out the potential for future work on future grants. Once we reach out to our municipalities, we offer assistance with starting pilot programs. This assistance can take the form of discussing needs, costs, and best plans of action for a community given its capacity, resources, and residents. For town representatives who are not decision makers but are interested in composting, we can offer to help advocate for programs and initiatives with select boards and councils. If a municipality doesn't immediately connect with us after we reach out, we're also more than happy to offer this assistance on call later in our grant period. We've also used this funding to develop tip sheets for municipalities that they can reference on their own to begin to think through what their program might look like in their respective communities. Here, I've included a few screenshots from our various tip sheets. Altogether, we want to help connect municipalities to the resources they need to be permitted, help them determine the best approach to a pilot program for their community, connect them to other resources such as NHDS, haulers, or farms that would be part of their composting process, and answer some of our frequently asked questions from our past workshops. In addition to providing these to our municipalities outright, we bring these to our home composting workshops, which will be discussed later, for any municipal employees who may have missed our initial outreach. I'd like to take a moment to talk about the 3 municipalities in our 27 municipality region that currently have composting programs. These municipalities are Lebanon, New London, and Washington. They all look a little different, so this is also a great opportunity to talk about what they're doing and why. In 2022, Lebanon started a 30 household pilot composting program in 2022. That program ended up being about 11 families or households that completed the program in full, which included recording data about their waste in addition to bringing it to the Lebanon transfer station. With about 1.5 tons of waste diverted in 5 months, Lebanon considered the pilot a success and made composting free for all residents of the 2022 towns that use the Lebanon site, provided that residents have their permit with Lebanon, which I think costs about $5 or $15 per year. Lebanon composts on site and then uses finished compost on site for erosion control. In New London, the town's waste reduction committee implemented a 30 household pilot drop-off program in 2022 that, seeing success, eventually expanded to include 140 more households. Residents had to apply to participate, and their scraps are collected at the town and then hauled off-site. In the program's first year, New London diverted about 10.5 tons of food scraps, and I've heard from at least one member of the waste reduction committee that they're really hoping to expand that program to more communities and then eventually even more communities or households. Finally, we have Washington. Admittedly, I don't know a lot about Washington's composting program. I know that residents are able to drop off their food scraps, at their station. The scraps will then be compost on site, and that residents can procure finished compost from the facility. But beyond that, I do want to emphasize that Washington only has one full-time staff member at its transfer station. So we have an example of a town that still has limited capacity, like many of UVSRPC's towns, but can pursue and successfully implement a composting program. I also want to take a second to point out some of the resources that the municipality has made available to their residents. These are just excerpts of a couple of excerpts of literature that Lebanon and Washington respectively have provided, and don't paint a full picture of everything they provided to the residents, but it can be helpful to see various approaches toward educating your communities. Across municipalities, the materials mention what the facilities do and don't accept, and why their respective municipalities are composting. Lebanon's brochure, which is on the left, leads with the environmental impacts of food waste diversion, while Washington's flyer on the right leads with financial incentives. Municipal leadership will ultimately know residents' interests best, but know that there are a variety of ways to encourage people to compost. Likewise, we help the schools in our region learn about composting. UVLSRPC's composting education efforts actually began with audits and training in elementary schools several years ago. Our interest in working with schools stemmed from programs across the river in Vermont, which were led by Kat Buxton of Grow More, Waste Less. We then enlisted Natasha here from Composting Association of Vermont to help with our training. Several years later, we continue to work with schools. Our assistance involves helping school administrators with audits and education, with training geared towards school staff and education extending to the kids. In addition, we've also regularly contracted with Merrick Bennett, a local artist on solid waste initiatives, and has created several educational comics on waste that have been accessible for a variety of audiences, including children. Here you can see Corey, spelled C-O-R-E, Y, our composting superhero, in a how-to edition of Merrick's composting series. We've been able to share these comics online, as well as with educators and children in our region. We actually had a resident from one of our towns participate in one of our school trainings, which has helped inspire her to advocate for food diversion within her town, which now has its own composting program. That experience serves as an exciting example of how just one area of our composting work, school education, can impact other areas, such as municipal operations. So this December, we assisted Hillsborough Deering Elementary School with a food waste audit. UVSRPC was contacted by the food director for the entirety of the Hillsborough Deering School District, which includes 3 schools, and she had an interest in diverting food waste across the district. The food director herself composted, and she had a vision of creating a school garden that students from around the district could learn and eat from, with the older high school students helping manage part of it as part of a volunteer program that many of the students already partake in. Of course, composting food would help the district, 1, both reduce food waste, and 2, generate nutrient-rich soil for that garden. So after talking with the food director, we decided to start small, and UVLSRPC coordinated a week-long lunchtime audit at the elementary school with the food director. We supplied her with the tracking tools and worksheets to help her estimate how much waste the kids generated. And I attended the audit in person to help her and other school staff manage the waste at the end of the lunch periods and teach the children how to sort their food. At the end of the day, the food director would take the food scraps back to her home, where she would weigh the waste generated and add it to her composting system. And overall, it went well. It took a couple days, and for the youngest kids, a lot of hands-on assistance. The youngest children can't read the signs, so we went very picture heavy and did a lot of in-person demonstrations of how to sort your food. So we were able to help them, and eventually they got there, even the youngest ones. They were also extremely curious. We faced a constant barrage of questions from the kids who were eager to learn, but also just wanted to know what was happening and why. As you can see, I also put on a worm costume that my colleague made, which generated more questions from the kids and gave me an opportunity to talk about the science behind composting. And in my mind, hopefully it also gave the kids something to talk about with their parents when they went home. Most notably for me, though, was how shocked the children were by how much food they wasted. On a typical day, they would dump their food. On a typical day, not during the audit, they would dump their food in the trash and never see it again. During the audit, they had to take the time to set aside their scraps and add it to the growing pile of waste that the kids before them had started. They were surprised to see all the leftovers and equally surprised to know all the food, a good portion of it untouched, didn't go to anyone else for any greater purpose. For me, seeing the impact on the kids was the most personally impactful part of our most recent audit. Once we completed the audit, UVLSRPC was able to make a few recommendations for the food director for next steps. She may have been interested in conducting audits the 2 other schools to see how older children might fare. We helped make recommendations for her on composting systems and diversion solutions before she could start implementing a full program. And we were ultimately able to supply her with a few composting bins that she and the children could use to practice composting on the campus. In 2020, during the pandemic, UVLSRPC also created several online trainings and a resource hub for schools interested in composting. Trainers included Natasha here and Cindy Sterling from the Northeast Resource Recovery Association. Trainings covered why food waste diversion is important, New Hampshire state regulations, evaluating food waste and diversion options, lesson plans, managing on-site composting, tracking your composting program, and adapting your school composting program. Resources from other sources, such as the NRRA, Cornell University, and the Northeast Recycling Council were also suggested. All of our videos were then uploaded for the public onto the UVLSRPC YouTube channel. And finally, we have our resident-focused home composting workshops. I'm a bit eager to talk about these specifically because we're about to start ramping up our home composting series, and I've been diving into them over the past couple of weeks. In our home composting workshops, we try to educate individuals about composting. You might wonder why we'd bother to work on this level, which may seem like it could have a smaller impact than helping municipal staff or an institution like a school. But we generate a lot of waste at home. An estimated 43% of food waste comes from households. And when we think back to the municipal capacity concerns that I had touched on initially, helping our residents learn about and manage their food waste can help our municipalities run their own food waste diversion programs. So we've decided to go to the people, both strategically and physically. Each year, we've chosen 3 to 6 communities that span the region to host a 2-hour educational event. Remember when I said that we reach out to our municipalities at the start of every grant round? Sometimes municipal staff don't have the time to pursue a municipal program, but they still want their residents to learn about waste. In that case, we might decide to bring a workshop to their town. In these workshops, we review why you might compost, the science behind composting, and how to compost at home. We advertise these workshops broadly, inviting residents from around the area to attend, even if they don't live in the host town. In some of the host towns that we've had closer to the river, we've had people even over from Vermont come to join us. We found a lot of support from various groups that may be interested in working with you, a leader, and have been interested in working with us. We've coordinated workshops through select boards, transfer stations, conservation commissions, and garden clubs. I also recently received a great suggestion of advertising these workshops at household hazardous waste collections, which we'll be trying for the first time this year. Those groups that I mentioned, by the way, may all be great to reach back out to or to connect to one another when trying to generate support for your municipal pilot program. Anyway, one of the biggest focuses of these composting workshops is accessibility. We want composting to feel accessible, in part, yes, because it is, but a lot of people worry that taking care of their compost is going to be just another household chore. And yes, it kind of is, but we can all get through it fairly easily. So, accessibility. We want people to feel like they can tackle composting wherever they're at. To me, that's meant two things. One, talking through various setups and why someone might pursue a particular route. We want to show people their options. So the question becomes, what does composting look like for me, as opposed to, should I compost? And two, encouraging people to ask questions. Maybe you're a snowbird and leave for the winter. Will your compost be okay? Yes. And then maybe a few people in the audience can relate and have that worry dissolve. More than one person is probably worried about wildlife. More than one person is probably worried about finding browns for their pile. We want to review how composting is possible for them and address these concerns before they leave the workshops and determine if they want to start their composting journey. Plus, when we have the funding to do so, we try to make composting a little easier with giveaways. At several events, we provided composting bins or kitchen caddies that attendees can take home. Hopefully, that incentivizes them to start composting. And if not, I like to think that they're then taking these physical reminders of composting home, setting them aside, and if they haven't started composting yet, they just have this item staring at them, shaming them into eventually using it in composting. Before I move on, I really want to highlight this one point, which is that some of our most successful events have been our most interactive. No one likes being lectured at for too long. When we push the audience to ask questions and make composting more of a conversation, we can help them. And almost always, after they ask me a bunch of questions or ask other presenters a bunch of questions, they start to talk to each other. With one another, they share their experiences with composting and food waste and begin to learn more about what their own neighbors are doing in this space. This communication helps make composting feel more real, more achievable, and more like a community effort. And when they feel like it's a community effort, maybe they can see how they can bring composting to their select boards or to their respective institutions. And if not, at least you have more people committed to reducing their food waste. So where does that ultimately leave us? Well, thinking back to the start of the presentation, we know food waste is a problem. Food waste, New Hampshire is taking steps to reduce food waste. In New Hampshire, we're starting to look forward to a future with increasing regulations and also more funding. But not everyone feels prepared for that. But guess what? That's okay. We have great partners in Vermont with so much experience and aid to offer, and they have been instrumental in helping us get our programs off the ground, bringing technical assistance and education to a variety of audiences, including municipal staff, institutional leaders, residents, and children, will help create confidence in food waste reduction strategies. And that confidence can in turn, one, help create support for greater food waste efforts at various scales, municipal, institutional, or community, and two, make people feel prepared for future with a changing regulatory landscape. We're taking steps to prepare, and well, in general, we're putting some good into the world. Thank you for taking the time to learn more about what UVLSRPC has been working on over the last several years. I hope you've been able to take something from the work we've done in New Hampshire. At the very least, I hope I've given you a great jumpstart to the rest of today's talks. And because I harp so much on the importance of engaging with your audience, I'm eager to jump into the discussion portion of this talk. I want to learn more about the experiences you've all had and can start by answering any of your questions. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Majestic. That was great. It was a really good overview of everything your planning commission is doing. Do folks have questions? Yeah, Sarah Hobson, go ahead and unmute.
All right. Thank you, Majestic. That was an amazing presentation. I was just curious on your food waste hierarchy, if you have any sort of preference towards like donating that food, or feeding it to animals before composting, and if that's reflected in the policy at all as well.
Yes. So, while our programs do ultimately focus on helping different groups compost, we do often bring up the different levels of food waste reduction, which of course starts with kind of that source reduction. And for, again, like I mentioned, we have a lot of rural communities for some people, the reality is that they can then, maybe give some of their food away, or they can give it to their animals. The school that I had, as an example, I guess in several years prior, they'd actually done something similar where they had kids separate out their food, and one of the kitchen staff had pigs at home that she would take it and feed it to. So these are all things that we mention. I think for our residential workshops in particular, they're at a level where they are the ones purchasing, generating their food waste. So they can then donate it or repurpose it. Whereas for groups like municipalities, they're ultimately being the ones to receive it. And so a lot of times they're getting it in kind of conditions where they can't do something more with it. But I guess in short, we talk about these things when we speak with people, although our composting does ultimately focus on that kind of end process, how to go.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Anybody else? Any other questions? While you're thinking about that, Majestic, I have a question. I'm wondering if you know what other regional planning commissions in New Hampshire are doing, or if there's sort of like a network, and are the programs that you discussed also being replicated throughout the whole state, or is there a relationship there? Do you help support that?
There's a relationship there in that we talk to our other RPCs about the composting part of our program. So I mentioned before that we do this through funding we get from USDA. And in the past, and including now, a lot of that funding also goes towards things like the household hazardous waste collections. And that tends to be something that the RPCs focus a little bit more on. It's the composting has been somewhat unique to our RPC. So it's something we've been advocating for with other RPCs, and occasionally we see them kind of pop up and do something similar or encourage similar efforts. But I would say across the state, it's not a general, everyone's doing this.
Yeah, I wonder if that might be changing a little bit with the new regulations coming online. Yeah, Sarah Hobson, go ahead.
Um, I was also going to ask so it's really cool to see that there was a great funding burst, with, I think it was Act 300 that was passed. And I was curious, because it seemed like one of the issues at the facilities was low staffing. If there might be some sort of regular interval for funding that could go towards supporting more staff members at these facilities.
Yeah, it's something I'm also interested in seeing. I was fortunate enough to attend a 2-day similar composting series that was hosted by NRRA and HDS, where they talked a little bit about it. So they are receiving $1 million to go towards solid waste initiatives, and 500,000 of that is going to be going directly to grants for entities throughout New Hampshire, kind of ahead of this food waste ban. And we're not completely sure what that will look like yet. Obviously, we want some of it to be increased training. NHCS mentioned that they envision a lot of this will be towards helping different towns get the supplies for composting. Staffing may be a separate issue that will still be confronted as things continue, but at the very least, I think we have a future of having more of that infrastructure that will be taken off the burden of the towns to supply.
One of the things that this is sort of along the lines of staffing that Sarah just asked about. the Composting Association of Vermont is, as you know, Majestic has been working with, with farms in New Hampshire as well to do some community-oriented food scrap composting, as well as in Vermont and upstate New York. And one of the things that I've heard from Olivia at your RPC and from others is that who are on my steering committee for this project from New Hampshire is just this struggle of the technical support. And so it's great to hear that there's these, statewide operator training programs that sounds like they're getting off the ground and getting a little bit more traction. But I do wonder about efforts to build sort of a community of practice around trainers or having more people like yourself, like, the operators who can go out and actually help people learn how to compost at different scales. But then also there's this hauling question. So I guess I have two questions. Part one is on the technical service providers, and part two is just the idea of organic haulers and if you anticipate that will likely be something that will grow as the regulations sort of push that and create more of a market demand for those services.
Sure. To talk about the haulers first, I'm glad you mentioned it because that has been something that's come up in our part of the state very often, is we don't have as many nearby facilities for people to haul things off to. So those hauling costs are more expensive because they're hauling a farther distance. It is a real problem. Our municipalities aren't sending their own groups out to go and take food scraps because again, that's additional cost, additional staff. So that has been an issue. And from what I've heard, the municipalities who are interested in composting, they want to try to keep the waste as close as possible to being where it's generated. It's obviously there's environmental impacts of taking a long distance. There's also the cost. I think, from everyone, from the very least, I think like New London that we talked with, they're hauling offsite, but they want to compost on site. But again, it's like kind of this technical thing. I do think that for haulers, we will see a greater network trying to develop. One of our tip sheets includes things like local farms, particularly just across the river on the Vermont side, that have accepted compost. One of our towns, we actually reached out to ask about the home composting series, and they said, oh, like a lot of our residents just bring their food scraps to their neighbors. So I think there might be even more farms in the area that are willing to kind of, again, keep the food waste local and assist with kind of these distance issues. And then I guess to your technical assistance, was it the same questions? Do I see more of this coming down?
Well, yeah, or are there plans to sort of create like a, sort of educate, like a training of trainers kind of program where you're educating people to go out and then do the trainings that you're doing to sort of multiply the effect or expand the effect in communities? Because we do a lot of the support for your trainings and for on-farm composting and I'm getting more and more requests, which is great. And I'm very happy to do that. But ultimately, for it to be sustainable, I'd love to see I don't know if there's a composting association of New Hampshire in the future, but, a growing number of people in state who can provide the same services.
I think NHDS is hoping for us to get there. I think at the state level where there's someone in a position where they are really trying to help people right now through the permitting process and like letting people know that permitting has become easier, working them through the logistics. I think that's where a lot of their time has gone. And now it's kind of going towards looking at, okay, well, we're getting all this funding. How are we going to manage this? Like I said, the food waste ban is coming up in about a year, but we also don't know the sites that are generating over a ton of waste per week. So there's this whole other big project that the state is dealing with, trying to identify these people and work with them. So I think, that's something that the state would like to see. But there's also a lot of other competing priorities. For us, certainly the hope is that we can get other RPCs to do similar efforts, that we can encourage the people who attend our sessions to keep coming to them. I don't foresee us no longer applying for this funding in the coming years. I can only imagine we're going to keep doing this work, and hopefully we'll keep bringing more people in. And we've also been really encouraging our towns to communicate with one another. Lebanon's been really helpful. Again, they have their own on-site composting at the moment, with talking to our other towns and either talking them through what they had to go through or connecting them to us, which we can then assist them with.
Great. Any other questions? Sarah, did you think of your other one or?
Yes. I was just gonna ask about whether any of your the compost generator is being sold. I know you mentioned it's being used for erosion, and if that could be a viable source of income for these facilities.
I like that question because it's also something I was wondering. So Lebanon, like you mentioned, they've been using it for on-site erosion, which has been a problem at their facility. Like I mentioned, in addition to serving Lebanon residents, they work with a total of 22 towns, so they're really taking in a lot. Washington was the other town that is composting on-site, and from what I can get, they are giving it back to the residents. I'm not clear on whether or not it's free or it's sold. It is it's like an on request. They will bag finished compost for you and then either give it away or sell it. I'm not sure which is the case, but something that I'd also like to mention is I think Washington is also the example of the town that led with the financial incentives of residents to divert their food waste. They talked about taxpayer dollars going towards things like solid waste and being able to reduce your waste. And Lebanon's done the same thing. New London's also talked about, a bright financial future where diverting our food scraps really helps lessen a financial burden of residents and of the town. So, even if they're not immediately making money, I think they all have it, at least rummaging around in their promotion in the back of their minds that this can be something that helps people save money.
That's cool. And then I was also going to ask, was it a 50% reduction is the goal for this new policy?
In the state of New Hampshire by 2050. And that's not just food scraps, that's across municipal solid waste.
Okay. And I was going to ask whether there are plans or interest in expanding that down to like the curbside, household, residential level, eventually, as we did in Vermont with Act 148.
That's a good question. It's a question that a lot of our municipal leaders have. I think sometimes for some of them a little bit more in fear than in excitement because it's going to be a huge new thing to deal with. And that's something that I think this presentation was kind of looking towards is we've heard concerns from people about there's an interest in composting, but there's also an awareness that it takes effort to do, especially at a municipal scale, and then eventually a statewide scale. But we want to help people feel prepared, and we want people to get excited about composting and feel like it's something that they can take on as regulations increase. I can't speak for what will happen down the road, but I think a lot of people are anticipating that we'll start to look more like our Vermont neighbors, which is why it's been helpful to work with people in Vermont from our perspective. But I think we'll start seeing kind of maybe looking towards where a new direction goes, maybe in a couple of years where we're about a year past the food waste ban. That waste reduction plan came out in 2022, so they'll have had a few more years to evaluate how it's gone. They haven't had any updates to it yet, which I'd also be excited to see.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, and we
Thanks.
did have a comment in chat. Maureen says she thinks it would be great if New Hampshire had a solid waste districts so that small towns could share more centralized services, including compost sites.
Thank you, Maureen. I'll note that there are some of, again, we have a lot of small towns. I think, Maureen, you're kind of pointing towards that and that it could be helpful to collaborate. And I agree, collaboration will continue to be really helpful. But a few of our towns do share facilities. And so in places where there are already a lot of kind of communities coming together with their waste, it could be helpful to see those kind of nexus points working towards composting.
Great, thank you. Any other questions for Majestic?
And from my perspective, it would
Yeah,
also
please.
be helpful if anyone wants to put in the chat some of, the concerns or barriers they've seen to implementing composting programs in their towns and their communities. Again, this is something we do every year, and we always have people who want to work with us, and we always have people who don't want to work with us. And we'd really like to start drawing in some more of that not working to maybe ambivalent crowd. So
Yeah.
learning what people's concerns are would be great.
Yeah, and Kat, I see you turned your camera on. You want to chime in?
Yeah, thank you, Majestic, for that last thing too. I think it's really important to start out with, like, what are your fears? Let's address those. I was curious about schools. As you know, I'm doing Upper Valley Super Compost Project, and there has been some interest coming our way from schools in New Hampshire right along the river. And I wonder what your experience has been with schools in the Upper Valley, and if there's been any interest coming your way or any receptivity with your outreach to schools.
Yeah, first of all, thanks, Kat, for asking the question, and also for helping us with our food waste programs. I think we've had slower interest from schools compared to, like garden clubs, or towns, but we still have had some interest. The Hillsborough Deering Elementary School, that was the example of our main new school that kind of, I guess, district that came to us with an interest after our initial call. So we've really done one kind of new program this year. And then aside from that, we've worked with a couple schools in the past who wanted to do it on a smaller scale. So I believe we have one school that they have a snack time, and they have a lot of leftover fruit and veggie scraps from snack time. And so they've made that into, they have a little composting site on their campus. And after snack time, they bring it all together and they could talk about food scraps throughout their programs. But again, interest has been a little bit slower, and I think I'd be interested to hear what your outreach has been like, because schools, we work with them, but we have a little bit less of a direct line to them in our organization as a regional planning commission than we do to, like a select board or a town manager.
Right. Well, I know we have a meeting next week where we'll be able to get deeper into it. But in case anyone else is interested, I can just say that it takes a long time to build relationships with schools. And like a year or more per school. So it's slow. And I think that's really important, because it's those relationships that are going to make the project successful in the long run. So it's not just building the relationship in the school. But, I started out with talking with superintendents and making sure that there was interest on a supervisory union level. And then once I got that interest, then I presented to all the school principals. And then from there, I would go in and meet food service. So that was sort of the top down. Then I go in and I meet the food service and the maintenance staff, and then start meeting teachers, and then go outside the school and work with the town and the solid waste management district and community members on farms, and really try to build that community of practice. So it's slow and steady, and so far successful. And I saw the comment about funding, and you're right, funding is definitely an issue. And we're so grateful that we just received a federal grant to put in 10 more systems in the Upper Valley. So yeah, hopefully what we're doing here can inspire some of the schools. And I know that, you know, we're going to have to put schools on hold. We just, because of funding and capacity, don't have the time to reach into New Hampshire at this point, but we'd love to partner with other entities. Our project is really community based, so it's really important that the people involved live in the community.
Yeah, I really appreciate the point you make about being slow and steady. In the example of the Hillsborough Daring Elementary School, we really were brought in because we had a passionate administrator who was able to connect us to the rest of staff, and she wanted to see something happen. But she emphasized that it would have to be an ongoing thing. It'd have to be resilient. There'd have to be communication over time, because she was a solo actor. She might not be there forever. She wanted a program to live within the community beyond herself. And I think, that's kind of a note that can extend to other programs. A lot of times there's someone that's really passionate, but you need to have that community influence to keep the energy going, and to make sure, excitement, ideas, where how far that funding can go doesn't fizzle out.
Yeah, I think another part that, Kat, the role that you play in setting up the schools in Vermont, especially so close to the border, is it gives a great opportunity for field trips and site, like people can come over and see. And we did that, Majestic, you had a picture up at the Ludlow training, right? So even though that was a little bit further, a group from New Hampshire, I think a lot of them were school and community people. Like that's when I first met Maureen. That's when, we started getting engaged in that way, just to come and see, what does a site look like? How does it set up? Who is involved? And this is all just sort of pieces that can be built on. And so I think that's another really strong way that our cross-border relationship can be supportive, hopefully. We've had a couple other comments come in chat, specifically around your question, Majestic, of challenges. So funding, Kat picked up on that. Goals are great, but only if they're funded, right? So at some point we need to figure out supporting this work. Sarah Hobson added, for backyard compost, access to carbon, for aeration, for pickup, hauling, or options for rural areas and rural folks that don't want to compost in their places. Like, how do we get everyone on board? And so I think this really reflects back to Kat's point about the continued dialogue within a community and building those relationships as a foundation for this work. And then Rhonda added, I hear you on that one, Kat, in terms of the slow progress, but worth the wait when it does come together. And so I think that's really a commitment to sustainability takes time, right? We can't just sort of bowl things in and expect them to live on after we leave. And then Maureen just added, sometimes it's also possible to go ground up rather than top down in schools, faculty and PTO meetings. Yeah. We're just coming, we have a few more minutes. Any last comments or questions? I'm gonna go ahead and put up just my last slide for housekeeping, but happy to have a couple more comments if that makes sense. So Majestic, thank you again so much for your presentation and sharing with us what our friends across the border are doing and highlighting all of the great collaborations we've been enjoying over the past number of years, really. I do want to just give folks a reminder that the program continues at 11 today. Today we're having 4 one-hour sessions. So at 11 a.m. we're going to be hearing about implementing full school composting in Georgia, the wins and the worries. And so again, this is another opportunity to continue likely some of the same threads from this morning, focusing more in on schools and learning from what folks around the country are doing and what their programs look like. And I'm guessing a lot of the wins and the worries are probably going to be similar echoes, but it'll be interesting to hear how they've sort of addressed some of this. So thank you once again, everybody who participated, and Majestic for sharing. And I will hopefully see many of you back in about an hour.
Thank you, Natasha.